I'm Rick Lifton, the president of Rockefeller University, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all this morning to our Women in Science Fall Breakfast Program. For those of you who are new to Rockefeller, I'd like to say a few words about our community. We were founded in 1901 by John D. Rockefeller, who recognized that the major limit to advancing the treatment and diagnosis of disease was understanding the fundamental causes of disease. And so Rockefeller was created to bridge this gap, establishing our credo, science for the benefit of humanity, which has fueled our efforts over the last 116 years. We have 82 research laboratories, each led by an eminent scientist who reports directly to the president, and they're engaged in neuroscience, immunology, biochemistry, genetics, and cell biology. Our research bears on the fundamental processes that underlie every disease. As one metric of the success of our scientists, I'll just mention that there have been a remarkable 25 Nobel laureates in medicine and chemistry and 22 Lasker Award winners at Rockefeller since our founding. There have been no fewer than 5 Nobel Prizes, including 4 in medicine in the last 20 years. No other institution in the world has more than 2, and there are only 3 of those. So I think that tells you the remarkable distinction that our faculty achieve. And we awoke on October 2nd to the news that another of our faculty, Michael Young, had been awarded the Nobel Prize for his profound work discovering the molecular mechanisms of circadian rhythm, the process by which our sleep-wake cycle, our feeding and metabolism are regulated and coordinated with the Earth's 24-hour day-night cycle. So it's a remarkable place to do science, and it's a remarkable community. Mike is not the only Rockefeller scientist to have been recognized with a prestigious award this fall. That same week, Titia DeLonga, head of our Laboratory of Cell Biology and Genetics, was announced as the 2017 recipient of the prestigious Rosenstiel Award for Basic Medical Research at Brandeis University. And the following week, Corey Bargman, head of the Rockefeller's Lulu and Anthony Wang Laboratory, was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. And just recently, Priya Rajasethupathi, a new scientist who just started in March, was named one of the NIH Director's New Innovator Award recipients given to young scientists doing the most original and innovative research. I will not enumerate the additional dozen awards over the last several months, but suffice to say, this is an amazing place doing cutting-edge science in many areas. If this is your first visit to Rockefeller, I hope you'll become involved through our Women in Science Committee, an initiative launched in 1997 to encourage women in business and philanthropy to embrace science as a passionate interest and to serve as a source of support for women scientists at Rockefeller. Through this initiative, the university can provide fellowships to emerging scientists and support critical resources at the university. It's now my great privilege and pleasure to welcome Dr. Paula Johnson, the president of Wellesley College. Last night, Rockefeller celebrated the 14th annual Perlmeister Greengard Prize, an award established by Rockefeller scientist and Nobel laureate Paul Greengard and his wife, the noted sculptor Ursula von Rydingsvard, in recognition of outstanding women scientists. Dr. Joanne Stubbe, a pioneering biochemist at MIT, was last night's awardee, and Paula served as the presenter. We're thrilled that Paula agreed to extend her stay to give this talk this morning. Paula is a quadruple threat. She's a cardiologist. You laugh, I'm serious. She is a cardiologist by training, a scientist to her core, a natural educator, and an indefatigable advocate. She has devoted her career to improving the health of women through research, clinical care, and public policy. A native New Yorker, Paula attended Harvard and Radcliffe Colleges, received her MD and Master's of Public Health degrees from Harvard, and trained in internal medicine and cardiovascular medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where she and I overlapped as residents. I will tell you that at that time, even then, Paula was an obvious star. She was a spectacular physician, a visionary investigator, and a natural leader. She leads by example of her talent, integrity, and commitment to excellence. Before becoming president of Wellesley in 2016, Paula was chief of the Division of Women's Health at Brigham and Women's Hospital. which I'll mention is the most academic of the Harvard teaching hospitals and an amazing place to be a physician and an investigator. In this position, Paula founded and was the executive director of the Connors Center for Women's Health and Gender Biology, where she led efforts to both undertake cutting-edge research and to translate it into outstanding clinical care for women. During her tenure at Harvard, Paula was also the Grace A. Young Family Professor in Women's Health at Harvard Medical School and a Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard School of Public Health. Her topic this morning, Sex and Gender, Critical Components in the Quest for Precision Medicine, is a product of decades of work looking at how biological differences between men and women result in different manifestations of disease, making clear that we can't only do research on men, develop and test drugs in men, and then simply extrapolate the results to the other half of the population. This has critical implications for how we conduct biomedical research, how we perform clinical trials, and how we deliver health care. Paula and her colleagues have helped to revolutionize how medicine is practiced and how research is conducted. Paula's vision, research, and ability to lead at the intersection of education, healthcare, and public policy have earned her key leadership roles in the local and national arenas, including serving as chair of the board of Boston Public Health Commission and as a commissioner of the National Institutes of Health Advisory Committee on Research on Women's Health. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Paula has combined strengths and insights from medical science, psychology, and other fields to derive better models for investigating and treating women's health issues. She has trained a new generation of physicians and scientists who are implementing these approaches. And with her move to Wellesley, where she is now overseeing the education of the young women who will be tomorrow's leaders, she is doing further work in these areas. Wellesley is indeed fortunate to have recruited her, and I'm delighted that so many of Paula's fans from Wellesley are here to greet her this morning, and we are so delighted to welcome you all to the Rockefeller campus, and it's now my great pleasure to welcome Paula Johnson to the podium.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rick, for that very lovely and generous introduction. And I do want to say that it's wonderful to be here. For those of you who were here yesterday evening, I said this, but I'll share it again. Rick was actually my chief resident, and that's very meaningful, and he was truly extraordinary. So, Rick, it is just truly wonderful to see you here and at this phenomenal, leading this extraordinary institution. I do also just want to say that in 2002, when I was starting the Connors Center, we made a trip here to actually understand what you were doing in Women in Science, to understand your model. And I sat in this auditorium and watched. It was actually the person who was speaking at that time was the head of the World Bank with Paul Nurse, and it was really quite extraordinary. So it's wonderful to be back here, and it's really quite an honor. So today, I am going to talk about sex and gender and health and disease, and where we think and why we believe it's critically important to precision medicine. As we think about this, let's just talk for a couple of minutes about precision medicine. How does it differ from medicine from the past? Well, it implies new diagnoses, because if we can be more specific, we can think about how we split syndromes and how we think differently about diagnosing disease. It implies refined prognoses, right? If we can better understand disease in a more specific way, we can understand where diseases will go in individuals, what the prognosis is. It implies refined treatments, obviously, novel drugs and therapies and devices, targeting fundamental mechanisms of each disease. And it implies new strategies for prevention, because if we can better understand disease, then we should be able to now understand how we prevent it. And this is called P4 medicine: preventive, predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory. Now, many people actually make the error of thinking that precision medicine is all about genetics or genomics. And when I'm going to talk today about sex, which really is much more of a biologic phenomenon, and gender, much more of the social phenomenon, The argument I'm going to make is that we really have to include both. But let's just spend a second. Why is genomic medicine itself not fully predictive? Well, not everything is inherited, right? There might be genetic predilections to disorders, but there are absolute behavioral, societal, social issues that impact how disease is manifested in any given population or any given individual. Smoking and lung cancer. I'm going to talk about women in lung cancer as one of my examples, but smoking, I think, is case in point. The other reason is that sometimes if we think about what it is we're trying to measure or what it is we think we're looking at in terms of disease, we may not have the right answer. So this is a coronary disease. This is coronary disease. This is what's called an angiogram. I'm going to talk about cardiovascular disease. And the way we diagnose it really is through looking at these pictures, right? Putting dye in the arteries. Here's a blockage. There's another one. But that's a pretty crude measurement. And is that really the disease that we are looking to treat? What does that actually mean and represent? So again, we have to understand what is it that are our endpoints. And I think sometimes we today don't fully understand the diseases that we're looking at. We're looking to treat outcomes, right? And if we think about, well, how are we looking at those outcomes? What are they? Like blood pressure, the way we treat or think about things like blood pressure, prediction, outcome, prevention, is really through singular measures. Is that really correct? I would venture to say the answer is no. And we don't really know how all of these things work together. So as we think about these issues, sex and gender interactions, as we think about genomic medicine, sex and gender are very often rarely considered. And this is, we've made progress. I'll talk a little bit about that progress. We're making progress, but we really have a very long way to go. This is a report, a policy report that our group at the Brigham put out together with the Jacobs Institute for Women's Health at George Washington University and the Kaiser Family Foundation in California, really describing precision medicine, how sex and gender can drive innovation, because it became very clear to us that in this whole discussion of precision medicine, you were rarely hearing about the impact of sex and gender, and there were bills in front of Congress in which we thought it was critically important to get this information in front of our policymakers. So in this report, we really had a framework that was reimagined for precision medicine, that it was critically important to understand biology, we had to understand environment, and as I know so many of you in this room are sophisticated to know that today we know biology is not static. For example, the whole field of epigenetics, how our environment impacts our biology, is critically important. Lifestyle and behavior, critically important in how we think about disease. Patient engagement, what do our patients do or not do? Another very important aspect. But these all intersect, but it's very important to think about sex and gender at the center. And when I talk about sex, I am talking about the biology. So we are either male or female. Females have two X chromosomes, male have an X and a Y. Or gender. What is our social circumstance in which our sex is expressed? Now, for today's purposes, I am going to talk in the binary, but I want to be very clear that we know that not all people are XX or XY, and we clearly know that gender is far more fluid than the binary of being either male or female. But I'm going to use this as representation because even at the most basic of binary, we're not really including that basic binary in so much of the research that we do today. And we truly have a lot to do when we think about the issues of the fluidity of gender. And then these two intersect, and I'm going to go through a couple of examples today and where we've made discoveries, but where there's much more to learn about this intersection that will help us understand disease and will help us achieve to a more better defined notion of precision medicine. So just to reiterate that as we think about health equity between men and women, that it's critically important to include For example, very early in preclinical studies, we're really talking about sex, to include female animals, female cells, and for sure include women at the earliest levels of trials as we test, translate, in terms of thinking about the data that we obtain from those studies and translating it to the bedside, which frequently there's a gap. And then how do we measure outcomes? And when we measure outcomes, I think as Rick indicated in his introduction, that we don't just put men and women together, that we actually stratify the data and that we understand impacts of various interventions, various medications, various, whatever it is we're looking at, but we actually stratify by sex and other ways, stratify by sex and race and ethnicity is intersected. So lots more to do in this area, but this issue of equity, in my mind, is really where we get the quality and the value out of our research as well as out of our clinical care. Now I'm just going to go back in history for a few minutes because it's important for us to know that the big transition point in this field of women's health, okay, of thinking about sex, particularly as an important variable, happened in 1993. And it was in 1993 that President Bill Clinton signed the NIH Revitalization Act. And what this bill did was that it mandated the inclusion of women in phase 3 clinical trials that were funded by the NIH. Now, only phase 3. Phase 3 is the later phase of clinical trials. It said nothing about earlier phase clinical trials, and it said nothing about preclinical studies. But this is important because the way this happened was that this was post Anita Hill, and it was that wave of women that came into Congress. And what happened was they realized that the Physicians' Health Study, which came from Rick and our home institution, it was a very popular, very renowned study of male physicians. And it was the study that proved that aspirin prevented heart attacks. When that group of women in Congress found out that this was only done in men, they were beside themselves. And they then took up work with the NIH and with Congress and really got this bill passed. Now, what progress have we made since that time? This really caused quite a different direction. And since 1993, we've recognized that every cell has a sex, okay? Your XXXY minority may not be, but that's the predominant. And that these genetic differences are very significant and really produce differences in disease, sex differences in disease, across all of our organ systems. From our brains, to our hearts, to our lungs, to our joints, every organ system. But we are really only at the beginning of understanding what those differences truly are. And we've included women in reasonable numbers, but for sure not in the way we should, and the whole area of preclinical research is ripe for transformation. The other thing we've recognized is that thinking about sex across the lifespan, thinking about this aspect of both sex and gender across the lifespan is critically important. There was a time when we really only considered sex being important in terms of women at key moments, whether you were childbearing or whether you were going through menopause, right? And what we've now learned is that the experience and the health of our girls, okay, the things that we experience early in our lives that are gendered and also differ by sex impact our health as we age. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And without a doubt, the health of women who give birth to children, their health impacts the health of the next generation in ways that we are only beginning to fully understand. One example is that women in pregnancy who have preeclampsia, which is a combination of hypertension, high blood pressure, and protein in the urine, those women who have children, those children are at higher risk for developing cardiovascular disease. We're going to talk a little bit about those disorders in terms of the impact on women's health, on the health of women themselves, but just to say that health across the lifespan, we've begun to understand the importance of thinking about sex and gender. So there are 4 major diseases in which we've begun to make progress, and in each of these major health risks, cardiovascular disease, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease being the #1 cause of mortality in women, lung cancer being the #1 cancer killer of women, depression, the #1 cause of morbidity for women across the world, and Alzheimer's, clearly an increasing issue for our society, and women are almost 2-fold more likely to develop Alzheimer's than men, and it's not only because we live a few years longer. There are some very significant biologic differences that we're beginning to understand, but much more work to be done. And here, the caregiving aspect of the women who care for those with Alzheimer's, also a health risk, and we're going to talk about that. But there's significance in these diseases between women and men, and we still don't fully understand why. So let's just begin with cardiovascular disease. It's the #1 cause of death in women, not only in the United States, but across the world. Now, this is just a cartoon to show you an artery. This is an artery cut across in long view. The yellow is the wall of the artery, the red is the blood going through the artery. And if you could imagine dye going through this artery, this is a person who might come in with symptoms, and you see that there's a blockage here. These might be fixed with a stent, right? The little wire tubes that go into an artery open up the artery. Well, it turns out that this type of disease is seen in both women and men, but far more common in men. Women are significantly more likely to have what we call more diffuse disease. Now, what does that mean? If you look here at the wall of the artery, it's more generalized thickening, and the inside of where the blood flows through is narrowed, but it's more generally narrowed. Now, these 2 diseases in terms of symptoms might look similar, although women do have different types of symptoms, but we don't understand exactly why the disease is expressing itself differently in men and women in terms of the way that the plaque is laid down. It's an opportunity for discovery, because in fact, is it the same disease? We don't know for the women who experience this. There's very significant implications for these differences in diagnosis. And if you're not thinking about the fact that women are more likely to have diffuse disease, they're also more likely to have disease in these small vessels, then you're not going to do the right test. Now, what does that mean? Here's an artery. A is where there's a blockage, but it's very hard to see. This is actually a patient of mine who's given me permission to use, a former patient who gave me permission to use her angiograms. This was a person who came in, had multiple cardiac catheterizations where they shoot the dye, had continuous symptoms, was actually becoming quite debilitated and couldn't work. She came to us and we actually did what's called an intracoronary ultrasound. This is the ultrasound probe, this is the artery, this is blood. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is what a normal artery looks like. This is blood, the probe. You see that the artery looks pretty smooth. This is what was at A. It was kind of ratty looking, and actually when we measured the flow across that area, she actually had a blockage that was over 70%. We would never have made that diagnosis if we were not thinking about the fact that women are more likely to have this form of disease, and we used an FDA-approved technology that you get reimbursed for. And you can actually do this and then measure the flow across the artery. She went back to work and did quite well. But again, you have to be thinking about these sex differences. Myocardial infarction, another heart attack, another interesting area. Early when I was training, we all thought that a heart attack was caused by the narrowing of an artery, and it got so narrow that it cut off blood to the heart. That's kind of the simple way of saying it. Today, we know that that's not true. We know that the physiology underlying heart attack is that there's plaque. This is another cartoon. This is an artery cut in short form. This is the plaque. This is the blood going through the artery, and what happens is that these blue cells, these are inflammatory cells in a necrotic core. There's a fissure or a crack, plaque rupture, that happens. And there's thrombus, then blood clot that forms, and that blood clot, you could imagine, could grow quickly and encroach on the blood vessel, the way that the blood flows through. What happens? You get a heart attack. This is what aspirin helps to prevent. Okay, this is the way that aspirin works. It actually helps to prevent these thrombi from developing. Well, there's something called plaque erosion, where here's the plaque, there's a little less inflammation, but it's almost like taking that plaque and rubbing sandpaper on top of it. And what happens is that the thrombus forms, can encroach on the lumen, where the blood flows through, and you get a heart attack. Well, these two, heart attack looks like a heart attack, but the underlying physiology is different. Plaque erosion is more common in women. Plaque rupture is more common in men. What does that mean in terms of outcome? What does it mean in terms of the underlying disease, just like the way that the plaque is laid down in the prior slide? How do we understand this? Well, today we don't really understand why, and without a doubt, our understanding will be different by sex. We're beginning to understand that there are sex differences in what we call cardiometabolic biomarkers. So these are substances in our blood that indicate risk that may be involved in advancing heart disease, but there are sex differences in all of these. Lipids, adipokines, inflammatory biomarkers. We know that inflammation now plays a very important role in the development of cardiovascular disease. Endothelial biomarkers, biomarkers of myocyte injury and stress, and kidney biomarkers. So we're moving forward in understanding where there are indicators of sex differences. What we haven't been able to do yet is really map those markers, those indicators, to what are physiologic pathways that might explain these differences that get us to a very different level of understanding of disease. Reproductive health and cardiovascular health have lived in separate silos for many years. And actually, years ago, women's health was only considered to be reproductive health. Today, we know that they are connected. Preeclampsia, I just defined that for you, high blood pressure and protein in the urine. 5% of our women who give birth, and the numbers are increasing. There are also some very interesting race and ethnicity differences. Black women, Latina women are more likely to have preeclampsia. Partially, it might be a genetic underpinning, but also related to obesity. Gestational diabetes, diabetes during pregnancy. We used to think this was only a disease of pregnancy. Today, we know that if you have pregnancy and diabetes, that your risk of developing type 2 diabetes later in life is significantly elevated. Preterm delivery that occurs in 12% of our population, and low birth weight in 7%. If we begin to look at this group of disorders of pregnancy, what we've come to understand that they confer a twofold increase in cardiovascular death in the women who experience them over their lifetimes. And this is important because we tend to think of thinking about risk factors for cardiovascular disease more towards the midlife. These are happening early in life. And so one of the new recommendations for prevention in cardiovascular disease in women by the American Heart Association is that every woman who comes in and you are asked about your cardiovascular risk factors, you have to be queried about your reproductive health history. Your doctor needs to be asking you, did you have any of these disorders? This is a very interesting field because, for example, preeclampsia, we believe, is a systemic vascular disease. The biology of preeclampsia is advancing, and we're beginning. Ananth Karmanchu in Boston at Harvard at the Beth Israel is doing some really outstanding work in this area, and we're looking to really better understand how we prevent this disorder, but lots of work to do in this area. Now, I want to move on to some of the social contexts of cardiovascular disease, the gendered aspects. The experience of violence is the highest correlate of chronic disease in women. And if we look at violence in women's health, we know violence is associated with depression, with obesity, with cardiovascular disease, with substance abuse, and with chronic pain. And if you think about what we're talking about today in terms of the #1 cause of morbidity, actually depression is a gendered risk factor for cardiovascular disease in women. Women with depression, if you actually have a first heart attack and you're a woman, not a man, and you have depression, you are at significantly higher risk of a second heart attack. But if we think about this intersection of the experience of violence with these disorders, and we're talking about cardiovascular disease, again, this is a very gendered aspect of us understanding risk. And remember, as we think about this notion of precision medicine, how is it that we need to understand risk of disease, development of disease, and outcome? Caregiving. I mentioned caregiving earlier when I talked about Alzheimer's. This is a study from the Nurses' Health Study, and what they discovered over time, this is a study of nurses, longitudinal study observing health outcomes, is that the relative risk of coronary heart disease death in women who are caring for an ill or disabled spouse is about twofold that of women who are not caring for a ill or disabled spouse. And this is care without support, okay, without others who are working with you in that care. And if you provide that care independently for greater than 9 hours a week, that risk increases to threefold. So again, I want to give you a flavor of the complexity of understanding disease in women, and that the consideration both of the biology that we must need to advance, but again, of these very gendered aspects of the context in which women live their lives are also important. And they may be mediated through the biology, but we have to understand the intersection, again, of that biology and gender, and think about that as we move the science forward. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes on lung cancer. It's the #1 cancer killer of women in the United States. Smoking is still the #1 risk for cancer. 27% of women 18 to 25 years of age smoke. We know that there's a very, very difference in risk of smoking according to socioeconomic status. Lower socioeconomic status women, much higher rates of smoking. The rate of decrease in smoking has slowed for high school girls. Women are less successful at quitting. Now, why is that? What we have begun to understand is that in terms of thinking about biology, that there's an increase in nicotine metabolism and increase in symptom withdrawal in women. We actually believe that this increase in nicotine metabolism may lead women to become addicted to the nicotine more rapidly than their male counterparts. Success rates for quitting actually vary with the menstrual cycle. Maybe that has something to do with the metabolism of nicotine, but more work to come. What are the gendered aspects of smoking cessation? Well, fear of weight gain, increased dependence on social support and smoking status of a spouse, and how might sex and gender be combined in these to understand smoking cessation? Well, greater reliance on smoking to relieve stress and anxiety. We know from a biologic standpoint, women are more likely to experience anxiety and depression. So that's, again, gender and sex. And less compliance with nicotine therapy. Is that because of aspects of the way that nicotine is metabolized and or issues around these more gendered aspects? But this is important because the science of how we think about smoking cessation in women needs to be advanced, because our current therapies are not adequate. But I think if you think about that just at the bedside, in my office, when I would talk to patients about women, about smoking cessation, I would share with them that women have a harder time stopping, and that I may not know the answer for you today, but know that this is the case, but I will stick with you I will be with you through the various phases you will go through. And know that you should not feel shame or blame. Very simple words, but can be very impactful if we share what we know, if we know it, about this biology and the gendered aspects of smoking cessation. We also know that there's an increased biologic susceptibility to many of the carcinogens that lead to lung cancer. I'm not going to go through these, just to know that there is this difference, again, in biologic susceptibility in women with carcinogen, decreased carcinogen clearance, that then leads to increased gene mutations and eventually lung cancer. So the disease in smokers, women are more susceptible. But also very interesting is that women who have never smoked are 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with lung cancer than men who have never smoked. We know that these women develop lung cancer that is more likely adenocarcinoma as opposed to squamous cell carcinoma. And we're beginning to understand some of the risk factors, and we're beginning to understand some of the targetable gene mutations that are more common in women who are non-smokers. Epithelial growth factor receptor mutations are seen in 40 to 80% of non-small cell lung cancer and are most common in adenocarcinomas, but interestingly are most prevalent in women, Asians, and almost exclusively in non-smokers. I don't have time today to go through a story about a particular drug that had been experimented with and thought to be a failure, but when they actually looked back at the drug, they realized that given the target to the EGFR mutation, that in fact it was women who were benefiting, and the women were just such a small percentage of those in the study. And if they had not gone back to actually stratify the data, they wouldn't have actually figured that out. So important to take these considerations into hand. How do we better understand risk in non-smokers? Well, this is work by Mike Jackledge, who's a former colleague of mine at the Brigham, and he took national data and he looked at risk for lung cancer in women. This is a 30-pack year history of smoking, so yes, it increases risk across age. But if you combine having a relative, a first-degree relative with an early onset lung cancer under the age of 60, with some exposure, could be secondary to asbestos, history of pneumonia. If you put these all together with non-smoking status, all of these risks outweigh the 30-pack year history of smoking. So again, thinking about this issue of sex, thinking about what is risk, and again, redefining how we consider these questions in research is critically important in us being able to predict risk for disease. This is just a schematic. We had started, as part of the Connor Center, had started a women's lung health program because many of these disorders are not recognized as having sex differences. And we recognize the ability to not only push forward the research in these areas. This was led by a brilliant scientist, Yolanda Colson, who's a thoracic surgeon, but there's also the ability to think about, again, this intersection of sex and gender, and also think about how that translates to care. We looked at lung cancer, asthma, LAM, a disease mainly in women, pulmonary hypertension, bronchiectasis, looking at genetics and COPD. I won't go into this, but just to say it's a one-of-a-kind centers and has been quite successful in advancing the agenda of, and the science of lung disease in women. So today we've only had time to discuss 2 disorders, okay, cardiovascular disease and lung cancer, but I just want to bring you back that depression, we're beginning to learn about some of the sex differences in terms of the biology, but also the social context of depression. Alzheimer's, major issue for our country. Again, that science is advancing. I was actually just meeting with Dennis Selko, one of the leading Alzheimer's researchers at the Brigham and Women's and Harvard Medical School, and they are actually focusing very squarely as well on this issue of sex differences in Alzheimer's. So again, critically important to think about these issues across the research continuum. I do want to say a couple of words on drugs and devices, because it is important to think about how we develop drugs, who we test drugs in, what is the science that it's based on, and then how do we market them. Ambien, many of you may remember about 4 years ago, it was discovered that 4 or 5 years ago, it was discovered that women who took Ambien, which is a very popular sleep meds, many of us may take it as we get on planes to take long trips, but that women who took Ambien, and the recommended dose had been 10 milligrams, were found sleepwalking. Or they were seemingly awake, but essentially were really asleep. And it came to be that the FDA looked back at the data that they had, because they had included men and women in the trials of Ambien. And in fact, it was very clear that the impact of this higher dose in women was extremely deleterious. And it's the first drug in which there is now an FDA-approved difference in the recommended dose for men and women. The dose for men is 10 milligrams, the dose for women is 5 milligrams. Now, just remember, the data had always been there, but the data had not been stratified nor considered when this drug was being approved. This is going to be different moving forward, but there's a huge backlog of drugs in which these data are sitting in the FDA database, and we will not go back to look at those data. So how do we grapple with some of these issues? I think we're in a better place moving forward, but again, it is not ideal. Addy, which is flibanserin, some of you may remember a couple of years ago, this is a drug that was approved for female sexual dysfunction. And what was interesting about this drug, it was actually an old drug that was repackaged numerous times. And it was found that it had never been approved by the FDA. It actually failed approval twice because of some very serious side effects, which included hypotension or low blood pressure and passing out. It turns out, and this is a drug you'd have to take every single day. It's not like Cialis or, you'd have to take it every single day. So when the FDA went back to a new company that bought the drug, and they said, you have to test for these very serious side effects. So the company did test for the side effects, but guess what? Now, this is a drug for women. They did a trial in about 23 subjects. 22 of the 23 were men. And the drug was approved by the FDA. Need I say more? It actually has not done well on the market, thank goodness. But, and then the company sold the drug immediately after FDA approval. Devices, again, very important. We are doing somewhat better when it comes to pharmaceuticals. We are not doing that well when it comes to sex and thinking about male-female differences in devices, in terms of thinking about how many women versus men are included in trials of devices, and then really stratifying outcomes. Bodies are different, body sizes are different. This is an area where it is ripe for intervention at the FDA. And then some of our more common drugs, our HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors like Lipitor, where the recommended dose is 80 milligrams, very high. And for certain populations of women, this is really not an appropriate dose with very significant side effects. And if you don't understand this and don't understand some of the sex-based outcomes, you could get in a position of really giving women much higher doses than they can tolerate. Another area where there's opportunity for change is in the way we deal with our journals. This is a big study that looked at effective treatments for women with heart disease. And it looked at papers of trials that were essentially performed over 10 years or more, a little over 10 years. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but basically 65% of the papers had to be thrown out because the analysis didn't differentiate between women and men. Women were included in the studies, but they just had no stratified data. So the pink bars are studies that actually stratified data by sex, and you could then compile those data and do a meta-analysis and understand more robustly the outcome. The blue ones did not. What I call this is a waste of our investment in research dollars. If we include women, it is our responsibility to be able to understand how they are impacted, and that is not just by adjusting, it is really by understanding the difference. And this is some of the poor outcome that we see when we can't really make the most of research. So we had recommended in some of the work we did that there really needs to be very much more transparency and requirement by journals to have authors be very upfront around whether women are included in addition to other groups, whether numbers were significant, and able then to provide meaningful results. There was a huge amount of pushback for years. I would say that this is now changing. There are now many of our leading journals, JAMA being the leading one, and this really only happened over the past year, where JAMA Internal Medicine, whose editor is Rita Redberg, had actually made this requirement in her journal. JAMA was quite resistant, but they actually came along, and now all the JAMA journals do require more transparency. And what we had recommended is, look, on our foods, we require a nutrition label. Why not one for research? So that we can very clearly, we're not searching for it, we can very clearly understand women, percent, whether female animals were included, female cells, et cetera. We haven't gotten to this point, but I think we are on a much better road. About 4 years ago, we produced a different policy report, Sex-Specific Medical Research, Why Women's Health Can't Wait, and Elizabeth Warren got involved in this work, which was really wonderful. And what Elizabeth Warren did was she requested a GAO report, a report from the Government Accounting Office, on understanding where we had come since the law was passed in 1993. And what they found in this, and there had been a number of GAO reports, but Senator Warren has a brilliant young PhD scientist in her office, and she watchdogged this to make sure there were no cutting corners, no fudging of the data. And what they found was that the NIH had made important progress, including women in clinical trials, that women were at least equally represented in clinical research funded by the agency overall. But remember, those numbers include big studies like the Women's Health Initiative, okay, only in women to look at the impact of hormones, okay, on women's health. Very different if you begin to look at other studies. But there are currently no data on inclusion at the institute or center level. The Women's Health Advisory Committee, which was really formed to oversee how the law was rolled out, has no access to data on inclusion or reporting at the institute or center level, and that there's no collection of summary data on the number of studies required to determine if sex differences occur, or whether studies required to conduct these analyses actually complete them. So with those findings in the GAO report, they basically concluded that without these data, it is impossible to effectively oversee implementation and assess necessary changes to the inclusion policy, meaning inclusion of women. When that report came out, the NIH quickly responded that they agreed with the GAO's recommendation and they planned to take action. And as of January of last year, January of 2016, the NIH now requires the inclusion of female cells and female animals in preclinical research and the inclusion of women in numbers adequate to achieve more meaningful results. So that's now about a year and a half ago, a little more than a year and a half ago. We still have to ensure that the NIH does implement the policy, follow the policy. And I think those things are a little less clear in terms of what those processes will be. So I hope that through today I've convinced you that sex and gender in research and care are fundamental to the future of precision medicine. It's about the inclusion of women, inclusion of female animals, female cells, how we adequately power studies, how we look at results, but it's also how we think about the context of women's lives, the gendered aspect. And if we don't think about both of them, we are not going to get to this goal of precision medicine. And I'm going to leave you with this thought, which is that today we have a number of threats. We all know that our NIH budget is threatened. We know that the Affordable Care Act is at risk. This was a major boon for women. The contraception mandate is being eroded. Title IX implementation is weakened. This has tremendous impact on women in science, as well as the experience of stress and harassment of women in science. And environmental policies are being reversed, and this has a very significant impact on health that is gendered. So as people, as we are, of influence and members of a civil society, I strongly believe that we have a responsibility to work against these threats in order to advance the health of women, to advance the health of both women and men and the next generation. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.
I only have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Paula, for that illuminating and provocative presentation. We have time for some questions. We have microphones in each of the aisles. Please raise your hand and a microphone will get to you quickly. Thank you. Here we go.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I know we didn't have time to address issues of sex and gender and Alzheimer's, but could you just give us maybe a few bullet points on that? I'm really quite curious.
So there's, I think this is really an emerging field. There have been some early discoveries of some differences with regard to genetic profile between women and men. I think we're in the early stages. It's not, all women versus all men, but really at the very early stages of really thinking about and making discoveries. And I do think that this field is going to advance very significantly because it has become, I think, much more, our scientists are much more aware of this sex difference. And so there's not only research going on in the fundamental mechanisms of Alzheimer's, but also in thinking about this issue of sex in some of the treatments. And I do know, for example, Risa Sperling at the Brigham, who's been very focused on testing some of the drugs that we're now using, some of the emerging drugs, that really thinking about how those drugs differ with regard to sex. The other thing we're thinking about very differently is risk. So many of the studies looking at Alzheimer's really begin at about age 70. And for women, it really looks like we must start significantly earlier to begin to understand this aspect of risk. It gets to that lifespan question. So many of the studies now are beginning at around the menopause, so about 20 years earlier. So there are a number of I think, changes happening in the research arena that we should really be, in the next several years, really have more answers. There's one up there.
Have you done any studies about IVF in terms of effects on children or the mothers later in life?
The question is on IVF. We have not, but I don't know the answer to that. I do think it's a very good question, and it's a question that, again, crosses over into this issue of gender, right? Which is, anytime you give someone high doses of hormones, what does that do to their health over time? And I think the corollary question in my mind is, as we think about, for example, trans and how we think about giving men female hormones and giving women male hormones, okay, estrogen and testosterone, how does that really impact health over time? And I think those are big questions, and we don't have those answers yet.
Thank you very much. You seem to say that women are at risk more than men in many diseases, and yet, on the whole, women live longer, which seems to be a bit of a contradiction. So obviously there must be many ways that men are more at risk.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I wouldn't put it one versus the other. What I'm talking about are more the sex-specific risks that we need to understand, and that we need to understand how disease is expressed differently. And my only point isn't that it's not a competition between women and men. It's more that we really need to do the science to understand health and disease and the impact on women. Women do live longer, but let me just say a fact about that, which is that women live longer, but they, as kind of right after menopause and as they age, live less well. More chronic disease, they have a higher burden of chronic disease. And so, yes, live longer, but with more burden. So I think that this isn't an either or, it's really, let's just begin to embrace those differences. Because quite frankly, if we average, we actually don't get the right answer for either population. Average, men and women aren't averages, right? You're male, female, and then obviously we have to think about this whole aspect of gender. But what I'm just saying, let's do accurate science. Let's understand health and disease accurately, which really gets to this notion of precision medicine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. I was just wondering, what is the level of awareness in the physician community about these issues? And similarly, how the level of awareness among women patients?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Lulu. I think that the level of awareness for certain diseases is increasing. So, for example, there's been much more education around cardiovascular disease, around differences in symptoms, and some risk. But I would venture to say if you are under 50, or even not, how many of you have been asked by your primary care doctor what your pregnancy status was with regard to what I've talked about? 1, 2, 3, for a few. Okay, so that's really good because those are new recommendations, but everyone's hand did not go up. So I would say that we're advancing to some degree, but there's a lot of work to be done. And some of the simple ways, for example, that we can make diagnoses today still have not been fully embraced. Now, why is that? I could venture as to why, but I do think that a lot of what I'm talking about today has not been fully integrated into our medical education, into our undergraduate medical education. It has not been integrated into the way that we train our young scientists. We had a big grant from the NIH, from the Office for Research on Women's Health, called Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health, in which we trained young, very successful investigators and trained them in a way that whatever field or discipline they were coming from, it was a kind of a K grant, that they would be trained in this model of thinking about sex differences, but also inclusive of gender. I think that that is not routine. So again, not everyone needs to be a quote-unquote women's health researcher, but what is the definition of good science today? And how do we embrace these notions across the continuum? And I think we still have a lot of work to do.
Thank
you. I have 2 questions.
Yep.
The first one would be, what was your motivation to actually do the research and spend time? And my second one is, am I more likely to be diagnosed with lung cancer, even though my asthma is controlled when compared to a man?
Yep. So let's get to asthma. I think that's a great question. There are differences in asthma between men and women, between girls and boys. Actually, as we age, we flip in terms of what's more common in asthma, pre-puberty versus afterwards. But asthma is not associated, it's not a risk factor for lung cancer. So that's good news, okay? The other question, what motivated me? I think very early on in my life, I had members of my family who had experienced very significant illness that was not diagnosed, and then had mentors in college who were very important in my direction, in going in this direction of the study of sex and gender differences, and really initially as it pertained to my being a cardiologist and then expanding that work. But mentorship really had a lot to do with where I ended up.
Last question.
You mentioned that the FDA has lots of data that could be stratified and provide insights. Realistically, how hard or easy is it to do that analysis? And do you think that the FDA or NIH should be creating grants or incentives for companies to be doing that? Or is it better to be focused on every drug that goes through the trials now has a lot more rigorous analysis?
Well,
and what's the government's role?
No, I think that's a very good question. I mean, my strong belief is it should be both. I think realistically, given where we are with regard to funding, that's not going to happen. So I have hope that the fact that we're moving forward in a different direction, that's new. That was not the case 5 years ago. And the FDA, and really under Peggy Hamburg's leadership, and Peggy is really just phenomenal. Under her leadership, they really made some very significant changes in many of their requirements moving forward in terms of how they understand the impact of drugs, and I do think we have work to do on the devices. I think that the issue of looking back, the data are there, but they're not readily apparent in terms of how you understand those sex differences. I think with our current environment, I don't have much hope that that will happen. But I do want to leave you with optimism, because I do think it's a really positive, very positive, that we are moving forward in a new direction.
With that, I'd like to draw this episode to a close.
Thank you.
Thank Paula for an absolutely beautiful presentation and providing a very clear roadmap for the future and where we need to be going. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending this morning, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, Paula.